Season. Neysun Mahboubi joining us now from Philadelphia. He's a research scholar at the Center for the Study of Contemporary China at the University of Pennsylvania. I just want to get your thoughts on these latest developments. Feng Yilei kind of outlining some of the developments, and then of course Qin Gang's news conference. What do you make of all of this?
Well, the first and most obvious point is that U.S. and China relations are not very good right now. That's clear across lots of different metrics. There was a moment in early February where it seemed as if maybe the dynamic was going to get a little bit better with Secretary Blinken's visit to Beijing and the anticipated meeting with Xi Jinping himself. But that obviously didn't happen. We had a big balloon show up, and it's just been a downward spiral since then. So obviously bad relations at the moment. And I think on top of that, at this particular moment in China with this political meeting and all of the discussion about the Chinese economy and the headwinds that it's faced in the past year and the problems it has going forward, there is probably something about maybe looking for who to blame in terms of why the Chinese economy has not done well, especially when speaking to Chinese businessmen, which is what President Xi Jinping was doing the other day. So I think that confluence of factors helps to explain why both Xi Jinping and then Foreign Minister Qin Gang had some pretty, I don't know what the right word is, maybe somewhat more aggressive rhetoric that is specific to the U.S. In their respective remarks.
You know what I find somewhat humorous is I went back and looked at our interview from a year ago, and instead of saying the relations were not very good, last year when we talked, you said that they were unusually fraught, and I think that's a good way to describe it again this year. It's sort of like Groundhog Day. But you know, interestingly enough, there's going to be a lot made here in the West about Qin Gang's comments, and I want to ask you about comments coming from Washington, D.C., because Max Boot just wrote this op-ed piece in the Washington Post just the other day about this newly formed House Select Committee. And, you know, he talked about how bipartisanship can be a good thing, but when it comes to like what we're seeing now with these U.S.-China tensions ratcheting up at a dangerous rate, this Select Committee could perform a real service by presenting a balanced, nuanced picture of how the U.S. should deal with China. But he went on to write, that's not what's happening. It's engaging in bipartisan alarmism. And I want to get your thoughts on that, because even during the Cold War, you would see hawks and doves, some advocating a hard line against the Soviet Union, others advocating détente. But it seems like in Washington, both parties seem to have the same message. It's who's going to have the tougher anti-China rhetoric.
Yeah, and you know, I'm very sympathetic to that argument. I read the same piece, and I think even promoted it on Twitter by Max Boot, and I generally agree with that perspective. I think, you know, if you're looking at this from the standpoint of what's going on in terms of discourse in Washington, I'm quite concerned about the degrees to which the rhetoric sometimes can go off the rails and be too aggressive on our side. I think what complicates it is that this is a two-player game. It's not just what's happening in Washington, it's also what's happening in Beijing. And frankly, some of the rhetoric in Beijing and some of the actions that Beijing takes is not helpful to those of us in the U.S. who are trying to put brakes on the rhetoric in D.C. And just to give one example, you know, there's lots of language, I think, in Qin Gang's remarks that could be read, you know, charitably and could sort of point to a direction of the U.S. and China kind of finding their way back to some kind of, you know, stability. But, you know, then there's also language about the partnership with Russia and about how the Chinese-Russian partnership will not threaten any kinds of third parties. You know, that's not language that's really quite easy to defend in the current context in Washington. And I don't think, you know, I would want to defend that kind of perspective personally. And so I think, you know, it's worth always keeping in mind that both sides have contributed to this downturn in relations. And while, you know, maybe someone like myself can work on trying to tamp the rhetoric and maybe modify the approach here on the U.S. side, that also needs to happen on the Chinese side for the relationship to actually improve.
All right, well, it's great to get your perspectives, and maybe next year we'll start the conversation by saying it's not fraud and it's not bad. One can hope. And
one can hope.
Yes, dialogue is a good thing, and keeping the conversation going is always a good thing as well. It's great to talk to you. Thanks so much
for
your analysis.